Today we're coming to you from the campus of Oklahoma Christian College with a fascinating lesson on predicting the end of the world. Stay with us.
The Churches of Christ of the North Texas area present The Truth in Love.
How precious is the book divine, my inspiration give. Bright as a lamp its precepts shine to guide my soul to heaven. Holy Bible, book divine, precious treasure thou art mine. Lamp to my feet and a light to my way, to guide me safely home. It sweetly cheers my drooping heart in this dark vale of tears. Light to my life it still imparts and quells my rising fears. Holy Bible, book divine, precious treasure thou art mine. Lamp to my feet and a light to my way, to guide me safely home.
Welcome to our program. I'm your host, David Roper. Today we're again on the campus of Oklahoma Christian College, located in Oklahoma City. Directly behind me is the media center where these various programs are being produced. Several years ago, I heard Stafford North, Executive Vice President of Oklahoma Christian College, present a very special message on Matthew 24. Being impressed with it, we've asked him to present a two-part series on that special chapter and that special topic of predicting the end of the world. I know you're ready to hear that, so let's move into the Learning Center for a song by the OCC Chorale and this message by Stafford North.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing His mercy and His grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, He'll prepare for us a place. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory. Let us then be true and faithful, trusting, serving every day. Just one glimpse of Him in glory will the toils of life repay. When we all get to heaven, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see Jesus, we'll sing and shout the victory.
Certainly it's a pleasure to be with you today and to talk about a subject that we hear a great deal about these days, predicting the end of the world. You hear people speak to that point fairly often and tell us that we're now in the last days, or that the end of the world will come during the lifetime of those who are now alive. Some even go so far as to put dates on it. Once in a while we even hear about a person or a group of people who have decided it will be a certain day. They sell their belongings and go out on a mountain and put on special clothing maybe, and then stand there to await the arrival of the Lord, and so far none of those predictions has come to pass. Can we predict the end of the world? Does the Bible give us signs by which we can tell when the end is about to take place? Does the Lord intend for us to try to outguess when the end of the world is coming? One of the passages in the Bible that deals with that most directly, and the one I suppose to which most people turn when they start to think about whether we can predict the end of the world, is the 24th chapter of Matthew. If you have your Bible, I hope you'll turn to that passage, because we're going to look at it very closely as we study today. And you can go right down the line as we study this passage, and I hope you'll even mark in your Bible some of the divisions we talk about of this passage. We're going to talk about 10 different divisions of this chapter. And you can mark them in your Bible and maybe write a word or two in the margin, and that'll help you a lot when you come back to study this passage or try to explain it to somebody else. So, if you have your Bible now open to Matthew chapter 24, we'll begin to look at it very carefully. The first section of this passage that we want to consider, we might call the occasion. What was the reason why Jesus entered into this discussion? Why did he talk about the things he discusses in Matthew 24? What was the occasion for this presentation to those who were his disciples? Well, we realize that Jesus spoke a lot in the city of Jerusalem. And one day he was out in the temple area talking with people, and in the 23rd chapter of Matthew, just preceding the chapter we want to study, Jesus was delivering a very scathing rebuke to those who were the Pharisees and the scribes because of the way in which they had received his message. He said, "You're just like the prophets before you who would not accept, the Jews before you who would not accept the prophets. And you stoned them and you scourged them and you beat them and you treated them shamefully. And finally, when the last great prophet comes," he suggests, why, they're going to turn him down too. That, of course, would be Jesus himself. That's the implication of what he's saying here. Now, as we come to the 23rd chapter, and we're looking at verse 29, that's where we want to start our study today. Chapter 23 and verse 29, he gives the last of these woes. And he says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous, and say, if I'd been living in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partners with them in shedding the blood of the prophets." And then he says, "You really bear witness against yourselves, because you are sons of these prophets, or the ones who murdered the prophets. And so," he says, "fill up the measure of the guilt of your fathers. You serpents, you brood of vipers, how shall you escape the sentence of hell?" Well, that's strong language, isn't it? Verse 34, "Therefore, behold, I am sending you prophets and wise men and scribes. Some of them will you kill and crucify. Some of them will you scourge in your synagogues and persecute from city to city." Verse 35, "That upon you may fall the guilt of all the righteous blood shed on the earth, from the blood of righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah the son of Berechiah, whom you murdered between the temple and the altar." Verse 36, "Truly I say to you, all these things shall come upon this generation." All the heaped up woe that God had been storing up to deliver upon those who were rejecting Jesus as the culmination of these prophets. And so he says, all these things have been stored up that upon you, this generation, remember that phrase because it's very important, upon you, this generation, may come all of these things. And then there is that lament that we remember so well when Jesus says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. Behold, your house is left to you desolate." You, the ones I'm talking to, your house will be left unto you desolate. Now, when the disciples heard this particular discussion and this recitement of woes and the terrible doom he predicts, they called him aside and said, "Let's show you the beautiful buildings of the temple." I suppose they were looking for something that might be permanent in the midst of all this desolation he's talking about, and they showed him these beautiful buildings. And Jesus startled them with what he said as we begin chapter 24, when he said, "I say to you that the time is coming when there shall not be one stone left upon another that shall not be torn down." He looked at the temple. Yes, it's a beautiful building, striking building. Herod had beautified it greatly. But he says the time's coming when there won't be one stone left upon another. Well, that was sort of the end of that discussion. And ends the first section that we're going to look at, section 1, the occasion. Now we come to the second part of our study, and that is we're going to talk now about the question that the disciples asked as a result of that. So here's the question that they began to ask. He took them down the river, the brook Kidron, back up on the other side. They sat on the Mount of Olives. And there, as they could sit overlooking all of this temple ground and the city of Jerusalem, then they asked him a question. And here's the question that they asked, and this is in verse 3 of Matthew 24. As he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?" Or as that question is recorded in the book of Luke, where the question is asked in chapter 21 and verse 7 of the book of Luke. That question reads, when shall these things be, and what shall be the signs when they're about to happen? So here's what the apostles were asking. Lord, you've said some terrible things are going to happen. We want to ask you about that. First of all, we want to ask you, when shall these things be? When are they going to happen? And then are there signs by which you can tell us that we'll know they're about to happen? Fundamentally, that's the question that they asked, based on the accounts in Matthew chapter 24, and Luke chapter 21, and Mark chapter 13. So we take all of those accounts together, and these seem to be the essentials that they ask. When will these things be, and what shall be the signs by which we'll know they're about to happen? So that's the question which Matthew chapter 24 is written to answer. So let's keep that question in mind. Now we come to the third section of our study. This section in which we asked, which Jesus begins to answer the question that they asked. This section we might title, "The Possibly Misleading and Preliminary Signs." The possibly misleading and preliminary signs. Jesus begins to answer their question in verse 4. Notice how he starts. It's very interesting. He says, "Be careful that nobody misleads you. Don't be fooled by what I'm about to say." Unfortunately, many modern preachers have not remembered that advice very well, I'm afraid, and have misread what Jesus said here. Don't let that happen. He warns us as he starts, don't be fooled by what I'm about to tell you. And then he says, I want to tell you a number of things are going to take place. They'll be happening. But the question is, did Jesus say these were signs of some event that's going to take place? The answer to that really is no, they're not signs. They're not intended as signs. They are, rather, warnings that Jesus is going to give, saying, don't be fooled by these things. All of these things will happen, but by them you cannot tell when this terrible destruction of the city of Jerusalem will be. The Bible does not say that these earthquakes and famines and pestilence and persecution are going to get worse and worse and worse and worse and finally climax in this destruction. It doesn't say that. He warns them, I'm telling you the city of Jerusalem will be destroyed. And I'm going to tell you a sign eventually by which you'll know it's happening and that it's coming upon you. But lest you be fooled, I want to tell you some things that are not the real signs. I don't want you to get scared every time you hear about a war or a rumor of a war or a famine or an earthquake. Don't be fooled by those things into thinking the end has come. Now listen to the reading. Beginning in verse 4. Jesus said to them, see to it that no one misleads you. For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will mislead many. When you hear people coming and claiming to be the Christ, don't let them fool you into thinking that means the end is about to come. What end? The destruction of the city of Jerusalem is still what he's talking about. And you will be hearing of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not frightened by that. You can't tell by wars and rumors of wars. That'll happen all the time. Here's what he was afraid of. That when they knew that the city of Jerusalem was going to be destroyed, that every time they heard about a war, they'd think this is it. He's saying, no, 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 don't think this is it every time you hear about a war, rumor of a war. Later on down in the chapter, he's going to give them a very explicit sign by which they'll know. But until then, they're not to be fooled by these preliminary and possibly misleading signs. Don't be fooled by that. Now you may ask, how do you know he's talking about the destruction of the city of Jerusalem here? If you'll skip down with me momentarily to verse 36 of the chapter, we'll tell you how we know that he is still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Verse 36, or rather verse 34 first. Truly I say to you, verse 34, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Jesus says there, what I'm telling you prior to this point in the lesson, verse 34, what I'm telling you prior to that point, all will happen during the lifetime of those who hear me. Now, sometimes we have people say, well, he means not the people who are alive then, but the people who will be alive later on sometime. But you check the use of the word generation in the book of Matthew. Every time it's used, it talks about the people who are alive right then. In fact, back in chapter 23 that we saw earlier, in verse 36, he says, truly I say to you, all these things shall come upon this generation. Talking about the destruction that would come to those who were there in the city of Jerusalem. Upon this generation. And he meant by that the people who are alive right now. Surely, as he speaks in the same context and uses the same phrase, this generation, he's still talking about the same people. So, in the early part of the chapter here, we're talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, not the end of the world. And he says, out of that destruction of Jerusalem, I want you to know, you cannot tell that it's about to happen just because you hear of wars and rumors of wars. You can't tell it's about to happen because you hear of famines and earthquakes and persecutions. Those things will be going on. Life will be going on as usual. These troubles and problems and difficulties will be occurring. But by those, you can't really tell when the end is going to take place. But finally, we come down to verse 15 of chapter 24. And this introduces us to the next section of the passage. And this we might call the real sign. The real sign, verse 15. Having told them, don't be fooled by these other things, I now want to give you the real sign, he says. Therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place. Daniel had given a prophecy. And in that prophecy of Daniel, he has said the time is coming when there will be an abomination that makes desolate. He was talking about the fall of Jerusalem. He said that time is coming. And Jesus refers to it, and he says, when you see this agent by which the prophecy of Daniel will be fulfilled and the city of Jerusalem destroyed, then you'll know that's the real sign. Now over in Luke chapter 21 and verse 20, Jesus uses the non-figurative expression to tell us what the abomination of desolation is. Over there he says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies. So there he tells us what the abomination of desolation is. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, that's the real sign. Now notice where we are in our study. Jesus had been asked, after he had talked about the fall of Jerusalem, when will these things be, and what are the signs by which we'll know they're about to take place? In the minds of the apostles, that was like the end of the world, and they used that phrase in their question, but they were really asking, when will these things be that you've been talking about? And Jesus says, well, first I want to tell you, don't be fooled by all these things like wars and rumors of wars and pestilence and earthquakes and persecution of Christians and the spread of the gospel even. Those will not tell you when this event is going to take place. Don't be fooled by them. But verse 15, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, now there's the real sign. Now you'll know what to do and you'll know how to make your move. And so he says to them, I'm giving you the real sign, the sign of Daniel, the abomination of desolation. And when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then is the time for you to know the sign has arrived and you can do something. When the pestilence comes, the wars come, the earthquakes come, the persecution comes, that's not the time to do anything about our discussion today. But when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, now's the time to do something. And so we come to the fifth section of our study, what to do when the real sign comes. What do you do, Lord? When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, what do you do? And then starting in verse 16 through verse 20, he gives us the answer to that. Chapter 24, verses 16 through 20, he tells us, when you see the real sign, then let those that are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him that is on the housetop not go down to get the things that are in his house. And let him who is in the field not turn back to get his cloak. But woe to those who are with child and to those who nurse babies in those days. But pray that your flight may not be in the winter or on the Sabbath. What's he talking about here? Well, he's certainly not talking about the end of the world, is he? Because when the end of the world comes, you don't run for the hills in Judea. And you don't hope that the end of the world doesn't come when you have small children. and you don't hope that the end of the world doesn't come in winter, what difference would all that make? Well, none, of course. But if he's talking about the fall of a city, and he says it'll be harder for those who have small children because they're going to have to try to run in a hurry. Or when you see this army coming and surrounding the city, then is the time for you to leave immediately. Don't even go back to get a cloak. Don't go to pack a bag. If you're on the housetop, don't even go inside. You get out of there in a hurry because you don't have long to get away. And so as all of that begins to take place, Jesus says, leave in a hurry. When you see the army coming to surround Jerusalem, leave immediately. Now that's good advice about the fall of Jerusalem. It certainly wouldn't mean anything about the end of the world. When the end of the world is coming, we won't see an army surrounding Jerusalem, of course. But even if we did, it wouldn't make sense if the end of the world is coming to run to the hills of Judea. It wouldn't make sense to hope that you didn't have small children, to hope it wasn't on Saturday, or hope it wasn't in the wintertime. All of this fits perfectly if you're going to have to leave a place in a hurry, not to have small children, but or not be in the winter when you wouldn't have time to pack, or not on a Saturday when they would close the gates of the city. But all those things fit perfectly when they apply to the fall of the city of Jerusalem. So we want now to understand that he's talking about the fall of Jerusalem. And first he gave these things that are not real signs. Don't be worried when they happen. Then the real sign when Jerusalem is surrounded. And then you know to make your move. And then what your move is to get out of there as quickly as you can. Fits perfectly when we talk about the fall of Jerusalem. And when those Roman armies came under Titus in 70 A.D., those who understood this passage were able to do exactly what it says, and they left quickly. And Josephus tells us that Christians who understood this were able to get out of the city, and they thus avoided the terrible things that happened when the city of Jerusalem was destroyed. They understood this, they followed the advice, and they left the city immediately when they saw the Roman armies coming, and everything worked out great for them. So we understand now that by that Jesus is saying, I'm talking here about the fall of the city of Jerusalem. He will talk later in this chapter about the end of the world, but he hasn't begun to yet. How do we know that? Look back at verse 34. In verse 34, Jesus says, all these things that I've been talking about up to this point are about the things that will happen to this generation. Underline that in your Bible. It's such an important passage. And you study how Jesus uses the phrase, this generation. He does not use it to mean people who will be alive sometime later. He always uses that to mean the people who are alive at the time he's talking. And he means the people who are alive while I'm giving this sermon, Jesus says, while I'm discussing these things with you. Those people are going to see these events take place. It will happen during your lifetime. Well, obviously the end of the world didn't come during their lifetimes. So he must have been talking about the things that would take place during their lifetimes, and thus he's talking about the things that will happen at the destruction of Jerusalem. Now we'll have another lesson about this topic, and as we do, we're going to talk about other things in this chapter. And there we'll explore what Jesus does say here about the end of the world. And I want you to remember this about it. This is not a passage that talks about the end of the world and the fall of Jerusalem all mixed up together. After we leave verse 34, Jesus is going to talk about the things that will take place at the end of the world. They are not the same as what takes place before the fall of Jerusalem. They're different. He puts them in contrast. He does not say the two are alike. Rather, he paints the two in very different terms. And he shows us how the end of Jerusalem was in one way. It had certain characteristics and qualities, whereas the end of the world had a different kind of group of characteristics and qualities. Now, you'll see as we come to our second study then that what is being discussed here is not signs by which we can predict the end of the world. In fact, when Jesus comes to that part of the chapter, he says, I don't know when it's going to be. I can't predict when it'll happen. The angels in heaven don't know when it will be. It'll be like the world going on as usual. That comes over after verse 34, and he's talking there about the coming of the end of the world. I don't know when that'll be. I'm not going to give you signs by which you can predict it, but I will tell you this, it'll come unexpectedly upon you like a thief in the night, And so the important thing is to be ready. When Jesus talks about the end of the world then, as we'll see in our next lesson more thoroughly, He says, I want you to know, be ready. That's the important thing. Don't try to predict it. Just be ready when that time comes. And so that's what the main lesson for us is as far as the end of the world and its predictions is concerned.
Our thanks to Stafford North for that fine presentation. I know that'll make you want to be back next week for part 2 of Predicting the End of the World. If you'd like to have this on audio cassette, just send us your name and address to our mailing address to be given in just a moment. If you're interested in a video cassette, why, just send us your name and address and we'll send you complete details on that. Now, our featured congregation this week is the Seagoville Church of Christ that meets in Seagoville, Texas, in the greater Dallas area. The church there meets at 510 North Kaufman Street in Seagoville, and its Sunday morning worship service is at 10 a.m. They'd love to have you visit. Next week, we'll be back with part 2 of Predicting the End of the World. We hope to see you then.
This has been The Truth in Love, sponsored by the Churches of Christ of the North Texas area. For a copy of today's program, additional information, or Bible correspondence course at no charge to you, please write The Truth in Love, Post Office Box 865, Hurst, Texas 76053. Once again, write The Truth in Love, Post Office Box 865, Hurst, Texas 76053. We invite you to attend the Church of Christ in your area. Join us again next Sunday at the same time for The Truth in Love.